Captain Jake Morrison walked through the long corridor that led to the Galactic Council chamber. His boots made sharp sounds against the metallic floor. Behind him were 5 other human officers, all wearing their military uniforms with medals that showed years of service. They had fought in wars across 12 different star systems. They had bled on alien worlds whose names most humans could not even pronounce. Today, Jake was done with all of it. The chamber doors opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the massive circular room stretched out before them. Representatives from 47 alien species sat in their designated sections. The Vrel occupied the eastern quadrant, their insect-like bodies clicking and chittering as they communicated among themselves. The Nathani floated in their containment spheres, clouds of glowing gas that shifted colors based on their moods. The Yithian delegation sat with their multiple arms folded, their black eyes watching everything with cold calculation. Jake stepped onto the speaking platform at the center. The platform rose slowly, lifting him up so all the representatives could see him clearly. His face appeared on screens throughout the chamber, translated into visual formats that each species could understand. He cleared his throat and began speaking. 15 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Council, Jake said. His voice was steady and clear. We were told we would be partners in a great alliance. We were promised that our people would benefit from trade, technology, and peaceful cooperation. We believed those promises. Chairman Zreth, a crystalline being who led the council, made a gesture that the translation system interpreted as impatience. The Vrel representatives clicked their mandibles in what might have been agreement or mockery. Jake ignored them both and continued. In those 15 years, humanity has fought in 32 conflicts. We have deployed our soldiers, our ships, and our resources to every corner of council space. When the Kresh attacked the Vrelian colonies, human marines held the line. When pirates threatened the Yithian trade routes, human patrol ships hunted them down. When the Nathani food crisis threatened millions, human agricultural experts solved problems your own scientists could not. Commander Lisa Hayes stood behind Jake, her jaw clenched. She had commanded the defense of Station Meridian 3 months ago, when the Kresh launched their surprise attack. She had requested reinforcements from the Council Military Coordination Center. They had denied her request, saying that human forces were sufficient and that redeploying Vrel or Nathani ships would be too expensive. 300 human soldiers died in that battle. 300 families back on Earth received notification that their sons and daughters were never coming home. Jake pulled up a holographic display. Numbers appeared in the air above the platform. These are the casualty reports. 47,000 humans dead in Council military operations, another 12,000 permanently disabled. These numbers do not include the civilian contractors, the engineers, the medical staff, and the support personnel who have also paid the price. The Yithian representative, a being named Carthex, raised one of its arms. Captain Morrison, we acknowledge the sacrifices humanity has made. However, all council members contribute according to their capabilities. Humanity excels at military operations. The Yithian provide economic infrastructure. The Nathani offer energy solutions. This is how a functioning alliance operates. Jake turned to face Carthex directly. Then explain to me why human soldiers make up 78% of all Council combat forces, despite humanity representing only 4% of the Council population. Explain why our requests for support are consistently denied while we are expected to respond to every crisis immediately. Explain why the battle plans we submit are ignored until disasters happen, and then we are blamed for not doing enough. The chamber fell silent. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably. The truth was something they all knew but never acknowledged. Humans had become the Council's attack dogs, sent to handle problems too dangerous or too expensive for other species to deal with. The arrangement had been profitable for everyone except humanity. 3 months ago, Commander Hayes sent intelligence reports to the Council Military Center. Jake continued. Those reports indicated that the Kresh were massing forces near Station Meridian. She requested additional support. The request was denied. When the attack came, 300 humans died defending a station that protected Vrel mining operations. Do you know what the Council's response was? Chairman Zreth's crystalline form flickered with colors that suggested discomfort. He did not answer. The response was a request for replacement troops, Jake said. His voice had gone cold. Not condolences, not an investigation, not even an acknowledgement of failure. Just a requisition form asking Earth Command to send more soldiers to replace the ones who died. Admiral Peter Collins stood in the Earth Command Center, watching the live feed from the council chamber. Around him, officers monitored dozens of screens showing the positions of human military assets across council space. There were battle groups near the Vrelian frontier, patrol squadrons along the Yithian trade routes, garrison forces on a dozen different stations, and advisory teams embedded with nearly every council military unit. The withdrawal operation would be massive. Back in the council chamber, Jake reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a data chip. He held it up for everyone to see. This contains humanity's formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council. Every human soldier, ship, station, and civilian contractor will be recalled to human territory. We estimate the process will take approximately 4 months. During that time, we will fulfill our current defense commitments, but we will accept no new assignments. The chamber erupted. Representatives shouted in dozens of languages. The translation system struggled to keep up with the chaos. Chairman Zreth demanded order, his crystalline voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is unacceptable," Zreth declared. "Humanity has obligations. You have signed treaties. You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities." Jake looked at the chairman with an expression that mixed exhaustion and contempt. "We have fulfilled every obligation. We have honored every treaty. We have bled and died for worlds that are not our own. What we will not do anymore is allow our people to be treated as expendable resources. If the Council valued humanity as true partners, you would have listened to our warnings. You would have supported our forces. You would have at least acknowledged our losses." Lisa Hayes stepped forward and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. It was time to leave. They had said what needed to be said. The formal documents would be transmitted through official channels, but the message was clear. Humanity was done. As they walked back down the corridor toward their shuttle, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Behind them, the council chamber continued to echo with angry voices and desperate arguments. Let them argue. Let them rage. For 15 years, humanity had carried the burden of council security. Now they would learn what happened when that burden was removed. The shuttle lifted off from the council station and set course for Earth. Jake looked back at the massive structure, growing smaller in the viewport. Somewhere in that station, representatives were probably already drafting appeals and offers. They would promise better terms, more resources, greater respect. But Jake knew the truth. The council had never valued humanity. They had only valued what humanity could do for them. President Karen Wells would receive their report within hours. Earth Command would begin issuing orders to every human unit in council space. The exodus would begin, and the Galactic Council would finally understand that real partnerships required mutual respect, not exploitation. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison stood before the Galactic Council and announced humanity's withdrawal. In those 3 months, the galaxy had begun to change in ways no one had predicted. The first signs of trouble appeared along the Vrelian frontier, where the aggressive Kresh Dominion had been testing the borders for years. Human battle groups had always been stationed there, responding quickly to any incursion and maintaining a strong defensive presence. Now those battle groups were gone, recalled to human space as part of Operation Homeward. Commander Vex stood in the Vrelian Military Command Center, staring at the tactical display with growing horror. Red markers indicated Kresh fleet positions. There were hundreds of them, spread across a front that stretched for 3 star systems. The Kresh had launched a massive invasion, the largest military operation anyone had seen in decades. Vex had deployed every available Vrelian ship to meet the threat, following the standard defensive protocols that the Council had used for years. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Vrelian defensive fleet had been shattered. 70% of their ships were destroyed or disabled. The surviving vessels retreated in chaos, abandoning 5 colony worlds to Kresh occupation. Vex could not understand what had gone wrong. They had followed the proper procedures, maintained the correct formations, and executed the textbook responses to enemy movements. What Vex did not understand was that those textbook procedures had been written with the assumption that human forces would be present. Human tactical officers had always been the ones who adapted to Che-Ang battlefield conditions, who found creative solutions to unexpected problems, who turned defensive positions into offensive opportunities. The Vrelian military had spent decades relying on human expertise, without developing their own capabilities. Now they were paying the price. On Earth, Ambassador Claire Mitchell sat in her office reviewing the urgent messages that arrived daily from the Council. Each message was more desperate than the last. The Council offered increased resource allocations, better trade terms, and elevated diplomatic status. Some messages promised humanity a permanent seat on the Council Leadership Board, a position that had never been offered to them before. Claire read each message carefully, then filed them away without responding. Earth's position was clear and would not change. Across human space, the withdrawal operation continued. Lieutenant Greg Palmer commanded the evacuation team at Firebase Meridian, humanity's last military outpost in Council territory. The base had been built on a barren moon orbiting a gas giant, positioned to protect Nathani shipping lanes from pirate attacks. For 8 years, human soldiers had lived on that moon, enduring the harsh conditions and the isolation. Now they were finally going home. Greg supervised the loading of equipment onto transport ships. Weapons, vehicles, supplies, and personal belongings were all packed into cargo containers. The Nathani had sent representatives to observe the withdrawal, floating in their containment spheres and watching with colors that shifted between orange and deep purple. Greg knew those colors indicated distress. The Nathani were afraid of what would happen once the humans left. A group of Nathani civilians approached the base perimeter. They carried containers of various sizes, filled with their possessions. They wanted to board the human transports, to leave with the humans and escape whatever was coming. Greg felt sympathy for them, but his orders were clear. Only human personnel and essential diplomatic staff were authorized for transport. He had to turn them away. One Nathani, an elder whose sphere glowed with a dim yellow light, spoke through a translation device. "Please, we served alongside your people for years. We maintained your equipment. We shared our knowledge. We were friends. Do not abandon us now." Greg looked at the elder. Remembering the countless times Nathani technicians had helped repair damaged human equipment, often working through their rest periods to keep the base operational. He remembered shared meals, awkward but genuine attempts at cross-species friendship, and the mutual respect that had developed between humans and Nathani at the working level. But he also remembered the Council leadership that had dismissed human casualties as acceptable losses. He remembered the 300 soldiers who died because the Council refused to provide support. "I am sorry," Greg said quietly. "I truly am. But this decision was not made by us. Your Council chose to treat humans as tools instead of partners. Now you must live with that choice." The transport ships lifted off one by one, carrying the last human presence away from Firebase Meridian. Greg watched through the viewport as the moon shrank behind them. He felt a complex mix of emotions: relief at finally leaving, guilt about the Nathani left behind, anger at the Council that had created this situation, and a grim satisfaction that maybe finally the Council would learn a lesson about the cost of taking people for granted. President Karen Wells addressed the unified human government from her office in Geneva. The speech was broadcast across all human worlds and stations. She spoke about the sacrifices humanity had made during their time in the Council. She listed the battles fought, the lives lost, and the resources spent defending alien interests. Then she spoke about the future. "For 15 years we have been the galaxy's soldiers," Wells said. "We fought their wars, protected their trade, and died on their borders. We did this believing we were building something greater than ourselves, a true alliance of equals working together for common goals. But we were deceived. The Council never saw us as equals. They saw us as convenient tools to be used and discarded as needed." Wells paused, letting her words sink in. "Today, humanity begins a new chapter. We will defend our own borders, protect our own interests, and build our own future. We will trade with any species that approaches us with respect. We will assist those who need help on our terms and according to our values. But we will never again allow ourselves to be exploited by those who see us as lesser beings." The speech resonated across human space. Soldiers who had fought in Council wars felt validated. Families who had lost loved ones felt their grief acknowledged. Citizens who had questioned the costs of Council membership felt their concerns justified. Humanity was united in a way they had not been since the early days of their expansion into space. Back in the Council chamber, Chairman Zreth convened an emergency session. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Kresh invasion had succeeded beyond anyone's worst predictions. The Yithian trade networks were collapsing as disputes that humans had mediated for years erupted into open conflict. Nathani food production systems were failing without human agricultural specialists to maintain them. And dozens of smaller crises were emerging across council space as the absence of human problem solvers became apparent. Dreth sent another delegation to Earth, the seventh attempt to negotiate humanity's return. This delegation was led by Carthex the Yithian, who had argued with Jake Morrison 3 months earlier. Carthex had a new mandate: offer humanity whatever they wanted. Full council membership with veto power, shared access to restricted technology, territorial grants, financial compensation for past losses, anything to bring the humans back. The delegation arrived at Earth and requested an immediate meeting with the human government. They were scheduled to meet with Secretary of Defense Alex Turner in 3 days. Those 3 days felt like an eternity to Carthex. Every hour brought news of new disasters in council space. The Kresh pushed deeper into Vrelian territory. Trade wars escalated among the Yithian commercial houses. Nathani colonies reported food shortages. The entire structure of council civilization was crumbling without the humans to hold it together. When the meeting finally happened, Carthex presented the council's offers with as much dignity as he could maintain. Alex Turner listened politely, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When Carthex finished, Alex stood and walked to the window overlooking Lake Geneva. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun. After a long moment of silence, Alex turned back to face the delegation. 300 soldiers died at Station Meridian, Alex said softly. The council never sent condolences, never acknowledged the failure. Just requested replacement troops. Do you understand what that meant to us? Carthex had no answer. The delegation returned to council space empty-handed, carrying the weight of their civilization's collapse on their shoulders. 6 months after humanity's withdrawal, the Galactic Council was collapsing in ways that went far beyond simple military defeats. The problems were everywhere, cascading from one system to another like falling dominoes. What had seemed like a stable galactic civilization was revealing itself to be nothing more than a house built on sand, and that sand had been humanity's contributions across every aspect of council life. Dr. Henry Shaw sat in his university office on Mars, teaching a class about xenoengineering to graduate students. Before the withdrawal, Henry had spent 12 years working on Nathani agricultural stations, maintaining the complex environmental systems that fed billions of Nathani across their territory. His students asked him why those systems were now failing, and Henry explained it in terms they could understand. The Nathani are energy beings, Henry said. They do not think about physical systems the way we do. They understand energy flow, radiation patterns, and quantum states. But the agricultural stations required constant physical maintenance. Pumps needed cleaning. Filters needed replacement. Soil chemistry needed adjustment. These were tasks that required someone who understood physical matter in an intuitive way. Humans did that work because we are physical beings who understand physical systems naturally. One student raised her hand. Why did the Nathani not learn to do it themselves? Henry smiled sadly. Because we were there to do it for them. Why spend resources training your own people when another species was willing to handle the problem? The council operated on efficiency, not resilience. They optimized every system to use whoever was best at each task. Humans were best at many tasks, so we ended up doing those tasks everywhere. Now we are gone, and they are discovering that efficiency without resilience leads to catastrophic failure. The same pattern was repeating across council space. The Yithian trade networks had collapsed into chaos. For years, humans had served as neutral mediators in commercial disputes between Yithian trading houses. The Yithian were brilliant merchants but terrible diplomats among themselves. Ancient grudges and family feuds constantly threatened to disrupt trade. Human mediators had kept those disputes from exploding into open conflict. Now those mediators were gone, and the feuds had erupted with devastating force. 3 Yithian trading houses had declared economic war on each other, blocking trade routes and imposing sanctions that disrupted commerce across a dozen systems. Smaller houses were forced to choose sides or face ruin. The economic ripples spread outward, affecting every species that depended on Yithian trade networks. Prices for essential goods skyrocketed. Supply chains broke down. Planets that had imported food now faced starvation. In the Vrelian capital, Commander Vex stood before a military tribunal. He was being court-martialed for the loss of 17 colony worlds to the Kresh invasion. The tribunal consisted of senior Vrelian officers, their insectoid faces impassive as they reviewed the evidence. Vex knew the verdict was predetermined. Someone had to be blamed for the disaster, and as the commander who had deployed the defensive fleets, he was the obvious choice. "You failed to adapt to changing battlefield conditions," the lead tribunal officer stated. "You followed outdated tactical doctrine. You made no attempt to innovate or respond creatively to the enemy's movements." Vex wanted to scream at them that the tactical doctrine had worked perfectly well when human forces were available to implement it. He wanted to point out that none of the Vrelian military academies taught creative tactical thinking, because humans had always been there to provide it. He wanted to ask the tribunal why they thought 17 colony worlds fell, when the real answer was staring them in the face. But he said none of those things. He simply stood at attention and accepted the tribunal's judgment. The verdict was guilty. Vex was stripped of his rank and command. As he left the tribunal chamber, he passed younger officers who watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They did not understand yet. They thought the defeats were about individual failure rather than systemic collapse. They would learn the truth soon enough. Chairman Zreth convened another emergency session of the council, the 14th since humanity's departure. The chamber was no longer filled with the confident representatives who had dismissed Jake Morrison's complaints 6 months ago. Now the representatives looked tired and afraid. Their civilizations were falling apart, and they had no idea how to stop it. "We must face reality," Zreth announced. Humanity was not simply another council member. They were the foundation upon which our entire civilization rested. Without them, we cannot maintain our military defenses, our trade networks, our infrastructure, or our diplomatic stability. We need them back. A Nethani representative, its containment sphere glowing with desperate red pulses, spoke through its translator. "They will not return. We have offered them everything we can offer. They refuse all contact. Then we must offer more," a Vrelian officer suggested. "Give them control of military operations. Give them seats on the leadership board. Give them whatever they want." Zreth's crystalline form flickered with colors that suggested deep frustration. "You still do not understand. They do not want our offers. They want something we cannot give them because we never had it to begin with. They want respect. They want to be treated as equals. And we never did that. We saw them as useful servants, nothing more." The truth of those words settled over the chamber like a heavy weight. For decades, the council had operated on the assumption that their civilization was superior, that their technology and culture represented the peak of galactic achievement. They had accepted humanity into the council not as equals, but as junior members who would be grateful for the opportunity to serve. Now that assumption had destroyed them. On Earth, Ambassador Claire Mitchell received daily reports about the deteriorating situation in council space. The reports made for grim reading. Casualty figures from the Kresh invasion continued to climb. Economic collapse was spreading like a plague. Refugee ships fled from conflict zones with nowhere safe to go. The great galactic council that had dominated this region of space for centuries was dying. Claire felt no satisfaction in watching the council collapse. She had lived among the council species for years, had made friends with individuals from a dozen different cultures, and had genuinely believed in the possibility of a functioning multi-species alliance. But she also understood why humanity had to leave. The council's structure had been fundamentally broken, built on exploitation rather than cooperation. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to let it collapse completely and rebuild from the foundation. President Karen Wells called a meeting of Earth Security Council to discuss the situation. Military advisors presented options for limited intervention. Humanitarian organizations requested permission to send aid to refugee populations. Economic ministers worried about the spillover effects of council collapse on human trade. Everyone had opinions about what humanity should do. Wells listened to all the arguments, then made her decision. "We will offer humanitarian assistance to refugee populations. Food, medical supplies, temporary shelter for those fleeing conflict zones. But we will not intervene militarily. We will not send our soldiers to fight the council's battles. We will not prop up a system that treated our people as disposable tools. The council must face the consequences of its choices." Some advisors argued that humanitarian concerns required more aggressive action. Wells understood their perspective but held firm. If we save them now, they will never learn. They will rebuild the same exploitative system and find another species to exploit. The kindest thing we can do is let them experience the full consequences of their actions. Far from Earth, on the borders of Kresh space, Warlord Krethis studied reports from his military commanders. The invasion was succeeding beyond his expectations. 17 Vrelian worlds had fallen with minimal resistance. His analysts had predicted that the Council would collapse without human forces to defend them, and those predictions had proven accurate. Krethis had studied human military tactics during the years when humans served the Council. He had learned from watching them fight. Now he used those same tactics against the Council forces who had never bothered to learn. But Krethis was also cautious. His intelligence network monitored human activities carefully. He noted that human forces had withdrawn to their own territory, but maintained a strong defensive posture along their borders. They were not expanding, not conquering, not seeking to take advantage of the Council's weakness. They were simply defending their own space and offering limited humanitarian assistance. Krethis respected that. It showed discipline and strategic wisdom. The Kresh Dominion would continue its expansion into former Council territory, but Krethis made a note to avoid any conflict with human forces. Fighting humans had always been costly. Even when they were serving the Council, fighting them when they were defending their own territory would be suicidal. Better to focus on the easier targets and leave humanity alone. 1 year after humanity's withdrawal, the Galactic Council ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The formal dissolution happened quietly, without ceremony or grand announcements. Chairman Zreth transmitted a brief message to all former member species, stating that the Council was suspending operations indefinitely due to insurmountable logistical and political challenges. Everyone knew what that really meant. The Council had collapsed completely and there was no path to restoration. The fragmentation happened quickly after that. The Yithian Commerce Federation was the first to formally break away, declaring independence and establishing their own regional government. 3 of the largest Yithian trading houses formed a ruling council and immediately began trying to rebuild the trade networks that had fallen apart. They had limited success. Too much trust had been destroyed, too many supply chains had been broken, and too many grudges had been allowed to fester during the months of chaos. The Nathani Assembly fractured into 3 separate factions within weeks of the Council's dissolution. The divisions were based on political philosophy rather than territory. One faction wanted to rebuild something similar to the old Council, believing that centralized authority was necessary for stability. Another faction advocated for complete independence and isolation, arguing that cooperation with other species had brought nothing but disaster. The third faction, the smallest but most pragmatic, sought to build new alliances based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical structure. The Vrelian territories suffered the worst fate. The Kresh invasion continued relentlessly, pushing deeper into Vrelian space with each passing week. Commander Vex, stripped of rank and living in exile, watched the reports with grim satisfaction. The military tribunal that had blamed him for the initial defeats was now facing the same problems he had faced. The difference was that things had gotten much worse. The Kresh now controlled half of all Vrelian worlds, and there was no sign that their advance would stop. Captain Sophie Grant commanded the USS Defender, a heavy cruiser patrolling the borders of human space. Every day her sensors detected ships approaching from Council territory. Most were refugees fleeing the violence and chaos. Some were merchant vessels looking for stable trade partners. A few were military ships from various species, hoping to find sanctuary or perhaps trying to convince humanity to intervene in the conflicts tearing apart their former allies. Sophie's orders were clear. Allow humanitarian cases through after proper screening. Provide emergency supplies to refugee ships in distress, but turn away any military vessels and decline all requests for military assistance. The policy was strict but necessary. Earth's leadership had decided that humanity would not be drawn back into Council conflicts no matter how desperate the pleas became. One refugee ship caught Sophie's attention. It was a Nathani civilian transport, heavily damaged and barely functional. The distress signal indicated that life support was failing and that there were over 2,000 Nathani aboard. Sophie ordered her crew to provide assistance. The Defender moved alongside the transport and began transferring emergency supplies and repair equipment. The Nathani captain, An elderly individual whose containment sphere flickered with weak purple light thanked Sophie through the communication system. "You are saving lives that our own government abandoned. The Nathani Assembly is too busy fighting among themselves to help their own people. I do not understand how things fell apart so quickly." Sophie understood, even if the Nathani captain did not. The council had been built on a foundation of exploitation and dependence. When that foundation crumbled, there was nothing solid beneath it to prevent total collapse. The council species had never developed the resilience or self-sufficiency needed to survive without the systems that humanity had maintained for them. Back on Earth, President Karen Wells met with her cabinet to discuss the ongoing crisis in former council space. Intelligence reports painted a bleak picture. The death toll from various conflicts and humanitarian disasters had reached into the millions. Entire planetary populations faced starvation as food distribution networks failed. Disease outbreaks were spreading through refugee camps. The collapse was complete and catastrophic. General Sandra Lopez argued for limited military intervention on humanitarian grounds. "We have the capability to stabilize some of the worst situations. We could deploy peacekeeping forces to protect refugee camps. We could secure trade routes to allow food shipments to reach starving populations. We have the power to save lives." Admiral Peter Collins countered that argument with cold pragmatism. "Every intervention sets a precedent. If we send forces now, we become responsible for solving their problems. They will never learn to solve problems themselves. We will end up right back where we started, with humanity doing all the work while other species benefit without contributing." Wells listened to both perspectives, understanding the merit in each argument. The humanitarian crisis was real and terrible. Millions were suffering through no fault of their own. But Collins was also right that intervention would likely recreate the same dependent relationships that had led to this disaster in the first place. Jake Morrison attended the meeting as a special advisor. He had been enjoying his retirement but had agreed to consult on council-related matters when requested. His perspective carried weight because he had been there at the beginning, had seen firsthand how the council operated, and had made the decision to walk away. "The question is not whether we can help," Jake said quietly. "We obviously can. The question is whether helping them now will lead to better outcomes in the long term. If we intervene to save the council species from the consequences of their own choices, what will they learn? They will learn that humans will always be there to rescue them. They will rebuild the same exploitative systems because those systems work as long as humans are willing to prop them up." Wells nodded slowly. "So we do nothing?" "Not nothing," Jake corrected. "We offer humanitarian assistance to refugees. We provide food and medical supplies to populations in need. We open our borders to those fleeing violence, but we do not send our military to fight their battles. We do not take responsibility for fixing their political problems. We let them face the full weight of their failures." The decision was made. Humanity would maintain its current policy of limited humanitarian assistance without military intervention. It was a hard choice, and Wells knew that history would judge whether it was the right one. But she believed that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to let them fall and learn to pick themselves up. Across former council space, individual species and factions began reaching out to humanity, not as the council but as independent actors. A Yithian trading house requested a bilateral trade agreement. A Nathani faction asked for technical assistance with their agricultural systems. A group of Relian refugees requested asylum in human territory. Each request was evaluated individually based on its merits. Some requests were approved. Earth began establishing direct relationships with various species and groups, but on completely different terms than the old council arrangements. These were partnerships between equals with clear expectations and mutual obligations. No one species would dominate. No one group would be exploited. Everything was negotiated openly and honestly. Other requests were denied. When a Vrelian military faction asked humanity to join their war against the Kresh, the answer was a firm no. When a Yithian consortium tried to negotiate exclusive trade rights that would have given them unfair advantages, humanity walked away from the deal. When council species tried to recreate the old hierarchical relationships with humanity at the bottom, those proposals were rejected immediately. The message was consistent. Humanity was willing to cooperate but only as equals, and only on terms that respected human sovereignty and interests. Take it or leave it. Ambassador Claire Mitchell found herself busier than she had ever been during council service. Instead of dealing with one centralized government, she now managed relationships with dozens of different factions and species. Each one had different needs, different political situations, and different levels of understanding about what humanity would and would not accept. Some of the species adapted quickly to the new reality. They recognized that the old council model had failed and were genuinely interested in building something better. Claire enjoyed working with those groups. The negotiations were honest and productive. Both sides made compromises and built agreements that served mutual interests. Other species struggled to accept the change. They kept trying to manipulate humanity into taking on disproportionate burdens or accepting subordinate positions in new alliance structures. Claire had no patience for those attempts. She would politely but firmly end negotiations whenever it became clear that the other party had not learned from the council's mistakes. One meeting stood out to Claire. A young Nathani diplomat named Sethis approached her with a proposal for a mutual research agreement. Sethis represented one of the smaller Nathani factions, a group that had been marginalized under the old council system. His proposal was straightforward. Human and Nathani scientists would collaborate on energy research, sharing knowledge and resources equally. All discoveries would be jointly owned. All benefits would be shared proportionally. Claire was impressed by the proposal's fairness and clarity. She approved it immediately and forwarded it to Earth for final authorization. This was exactly the kind of relationship humanity wanted to build. Partnership between equals, mutual benefit, and honest cooperation. If more species approached humanity with this kind of attitude, the post-council galaxy might actually become something better than what came before. 2 years had passed since Jake Morrison stood before the Galactic Council and announced humanity's withdrawal. The galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted back then. The old Galactic Council no longer existed in any meaningful form. The Grand Chamber, where representatives from dozens of species had once gathered, now sat empty and dark, a monument to failed ambitions and broken promises. But from the ruins of that old system, something new and unexpected had begun to grow. Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the observation deck of Embassy Station Alpha, watching ships from a dozen different species arrive and depart. The station orbited at the intersection of 3 major trade routes, positioned to serve as a neutral meeting ground for the various factions that had emerged from the Council's collapse. Lisa had commanded military operations during humanity's time in the Council. Now she served as an ambassador, helping to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The transformation had not been easy. The first year after the Council's collapse had been marked by chaos and suffering. The Kresh Dominion had conquered a third of the former Council territory before their expansion finally stalled. The remaining Council species had fragmented into smaller regional alliances, each struggling to survive without the centralized structure they had depended on for so long. Millions had died in conflicts, famines, and the breakdown of essential services. But that suffering had forced change. The species that survived were different from the ones that had belonged to the old Council. They had been humbled by their failures and forced to develop capabilities they had never needed before. The Vrelian had rebuilt their military from the ground up, this time focusing on tactical flexibility and creative problemsy, olving rather than rigid doctrine. The Nathani had trained their own engineers to maintain their agricultural systems. The Yithian had learned to resolve their internal disputes without external mediators. A Vrelian shuttle approached the station and requested docking permission. Lisa granted it and made her way to the diplomatic reception area. The shuttle's passenger was a young Vrelian officer named Krex. He had contacted the Human Coalition 3 weeks ago, requesting a formal meeting to discuss a potential partnership agreement. Lisa had reviewed his credentials and been impressed. Krex had fought in the early battles against the Kresh and survived the disasters that destroyed the old Vrelian military. He represented a new generation of Vrelian leadership that understood the mistakes of the past. Krex emerged from the shuttle and approached Lisa with careful formality. His insectoid features made his expressions hard to read for most humans. But Lisa had spent enough time around Vrelian to recognize the signs of genuine nervousness. Krex was afraid this meeting would fail, afraid that humanity would reject his overtures the same way they had rejected every council delegation over the past 2 years. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Krex said through his translator. "I know that my people have no right to ask anything from humanity after the way we treated you. But I hope that we can discuss the possibility of a new beginning." Lisa gestured for him to follow her to a private conference room. The room was simple and functional, with a large window that looked out at the stars. They sat across from each other at a plain metal table. Lisa studied Krex for a moment before speaking. "I appreciate your honesty," Lisa said. "Too many of the delegations we've met with try to pretend the past never happened. They want to move forward without acknowledging what went wrong. That doesn't work." Krex nodded, his mandibles clicking softly. "We were arrogant. We believed that our civilization was superior, that we had nothing to learn from younger species like humanity. We treated your people as tools to be used rather than partners to be respected. When you left, we blamed you for abandoning us. It took us a long time to understand that we had driven you away through our own actions." "That's a good start," Lisa said. "Now tell me what you want." Krex pulled out a datapad and placed it on the table. "The Vrelian Assembly has authorized me to propose a mutual defense agreement with the Human Coalition. We are not asking you to fight our battles for us. We are asking to fight alongside you as equals. We have reformed our military, developed new training programs based on the lessons we learned from our defeats. We want to prove that we have changed." Lisa reviewed the proposal on the datapad. It was surprisingly reasonable. The terms were balanced, with clear obligations on both sides and provisions for regular review and adjustment. There were no clauses that would allow the Vrelian to exploit human forces the way the old council had. Most importantly, there were explicit protections for human autonomy and decision-making authority. "This is well crafted," Lisa admitted, "but words on a document are easy. How do I know that your assembly will honor these terms when things get difficult?" Krex met her gaze directly. "You don't. We have to earn your trust through our actions. All I can promise is that we understand what we did wrong, and we are committed to doing better. If we fail, if we fall back into old patterns, then you can walk away again. But please give us the chance to prove that we have learned." Lisa thought about Jake Morrison, who had retired to a quiet farm on Earth after years of military service. She thought about the 300 soldiers who died at Station Meridian because the Council refused to provide support. She thought about all the humans who had bled and died for an alliance that never valued them. Then she thought about the future and the possibility of building something better from the ruins of the past. "I'll recommend that the Coalition Council consider your proposal," Lisa said. "But I want you to understand something. If we agree to this partnership, it will be as equals. That means when we disagree with your strategies, you listen. That means when we need support, you provide it. That means treating human lives with the same value you place on Vrelian lives. Can you accept that?" "Yes," Krex said without hesitation. "That is exactly what we want." Over the following months, similar conversations happened across human space. The Nathani sent representatives to discuss energy-sharing agreements. The Yithian proposed trade partnerships. Even some of the smaller species that had been marginalized under the old council approached humanity seeking cooperation. Each conversation was carefully evaluated. Some proposals were accepted, others rejected. The Human Coalition was building a new network of relationships, but they were selective about their partners. The organization that emerged from these negotiations was called the Human Coalition, though that name was somewhat misleading. 12 species had joined by the end of the second year, each one signing agreements that emphasized sovereignty, mutual respect, and genuine cooperation. There was no central government dictating policy to member species. Instead, there was a coordinating council where representatives met as equals to discuss common interests and resolve disputes. Jake Morrison came out of retirement to serve as the first director of Embassy Station Alpha. He had not wanted to return to public service, had enjoyed his quiet life on Earth, but when President Wells asked him personally, explaining that his experience and credibility were needed to make the new system work, he agreed. Jake understood that this was humanity's chance to build the kind of alliance they had hoped the Galactic Council would be. On the far side of former Council space, Warlord Krethis consolidated his control over the territory his forces had conquered. The Kresh Dominion was now the largest single political entity in the region, but Krethis had no interest in further expansion.
His analysts had studied the Human Coalition carefully and concluded that humanity had no imperial ambitions.
They defended their territory fiercely, but did not seek to dominate others. Krethis sent a diplomatic mission to Embassy Station Alpha. The Kresh had never been part of the old council, had always been outsiders treated as barbarians by the council's member species. But Krethis respected strength and recognized that humanity operated differently than the old council had. The mission's purpose was simple: propose a non-aggression pact between the Kresh Dominion and the human coalition. Jake met with the Kresh delegation in the same conference room where Lisa had met with Krex months earlier. The Kresh ambassador was a scarred warrior named Vokath who spoke bluntly about his government's intentions. The Dominion would not threaten human territory. In exchange, humanity would not interfere with Kresh control over their conquered worlds. It was a pragmatic arrangement between two powers that had no reason for conflict. Jake agreed to the pact. He had no love for the Kresh, whose invasion had caused immense suffering. But he also understood that some conflicts were not worth fighting. The human coalition existed to protect human interests and support genuine partners, not to police the galaxy or impose human values on others. As Jake stood on the observation deck after the Kresh delegation departed, he reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The Galactic Council was gone, destroyed by its own arrogance and exploitation. Millions had suffered during the collapse. But from that destruction, a new order was emerging based on principles that the old council had never understood: sovereignty, mutual respect, cooperation among equals. Lisa joined him at the window. Together they watched the ships coming and going, carrying diplomats and traders and ordinary beings trying to build better lives in a transformed galaxy. "Do you think it will last?" Lisa asked. Jake considered the question carefully. "I don't know, but this time we're building on a foundation of respect rather than exploitation. That gives us a better chance than the Council ever had."